Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For those who are not part of the Martinos Center, this event is hosted by the Women in Science. We are a group who aim to generate thoughtful conversations about gender, but also about racism, discrimination, and cultural gaps. And we also aim to provide tools to have a safe environment to achieve gender equity. And so our goal and our mission is also to help create a workplace that's free of bias, to strengthen our community, and to increase and support the visibility of young scientists. And so as such, we organize events like these to achieve our mission. And I wanted to say too, before I introduce our amazing speaker, that we have our Twitter handle. Viviana and I have our Twitter handle on our screen. So please follow us on Twitter and Instagram so you can know about other events that we do. And so I also wanted to mention, please use the Q&A to ask questions. Try not to use the chat. Use the Q&A, write your question, and then I will call your name so that you can ask Dr. Ormiston the question that you have. So I think those are all the instructions. Now, I am so honored to introduce Dr. Margaret Ormiston. She is an associate professor of management at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She received her Ph.D. in business administration and industrial relations at the University of California in Berkeley. She currently teaches on the MBA, undergraduate and graduate programs in DC, but also at the London Business School. And she has received many, many awards for her teaching. She's also the recipient of multiple awards and grants for her research, which focuses or aims to understand how successful organizations thrive. Particularly, she focuses on understanding the role of gender in leadership. And her research has received a lot of media attention. And I am so excited that we all get to hear from her work. I think given this is an important topic in general, but given now, I think more than ever, we need to learn more about how to be good leaders and how to support each other. So we're again so happy that Dr. Ormiston is here with us talking about her research. And also I forgot to say, my name is Edmarie Guzman Velez, and I also work at the Martinos Center. So Dr. Ormiston, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Edmarie, for such a very nice introduction. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today about a topic that's really important to me. I have to say that my early research on leadership was actually mostly focused on men, because I studied a lot of leaders at the very top of organizations, and there just really wasn't as much of an opportunity to study women in leadership roles. And so it has been a really nice movement in my career as we've seen a slight improvement of women leading at the top, that I can focus on gender and leadership, which is something incredibly important to me. I welcome questions as we go along. Some of what I'm going to be talking about is a bit controversial, and really my focus is and hope is to have a dialogue about the topic, and as Edmarie says, is really about fostering an environment that's supportive of our junior colleagues, and in particular of our female junior colleagues. So I'm going to be talking about the queen bee phenomenon. And to get us there, I want to start with this little dog, a very cute little puppy who's yawning. Maybe a dangerous thing to do at lunchtime, but this picture of this dog makes me think of why we're here and the power that we have over others, whether it be other humans or even other dogs. So you're probably familiar with this idea back in the olden days when you might have been on a bus and you see someone across from you yawn, and 30 seconds later you start to feel a little bit tired yourself and you yawn. And there have been plenty of studies that have shown this, that when you yawn, someone else is more likely to yawn. It turns out that there are also studies that show that this happens with dogs. So you could try this at home with your pet. If you yawn approximately on average 90 seconds later, your dog will yawn. So what this highlights to me is why I love what I study, which is the power that we have over other people. Our behavior affects other people's behavior. But it's not just our behavior that affects other people, it's also our beliefs. What we believe in our head affects how other people behave. Okay, so this study was not done of cats, but done of humans, and what they did was they manipulated where they told the teacher, half of your students have performed very well on a test and the other half have not. So basically half of your students are smart, half of your students are stupid. And what do they find by the end of the semester? Well, the students that were deemed to be smart, and this was just a random sample, had done much better, performed better in the class, whereas those that had been deemed stupid to the teacher had not performed as well. And this is this Pygmalion effect of the power that our beliefs have, our expectations have on other people's behavior. So it's incredibly powerful to understand our impact that we have on other people. But meanwhile, it's not just how we affect other people, it's actually what's in our own heads that affects how we behave. So there have been a lot of studies within the area of leadership and beyond in psychology studying how when we're primed with power, we think of a time when we had a lot of power, we have control over resources, then I don't know, you might also be familiar with the experience where there's a plate of cookies and everybody grabs a cookie and then there's just that one cookie left. And what's going to happen to that one cookie? Nobody takes it except somebody who feels they have a sense of power. Those individuals, and this was a study that was conducted a while back, those people are more likely to take that last cookie. They're also just generally going to take more for themselves and they're going to make riskier choices. So there's some good and bad to it. But the point to me that I take away from this is the power that we have to affect our own behavior. What we think and what's in our head affects our behavior. So the implications of just this very basic discussion of psychology is that our behavior and even our beliefs have significant impact on others. And at the same time, what's in our own, what we have in our own brains significantly impacts ourselves. So if I take that, extrapolate that to what we're focusing on today, the goal of this talk is to think about the top-down and bottom-up approaches we can take to understanding how we can encourage the success of our junior colleagues. Okay, so where I'm going to present some research that I'm working on and I forgot to actually mention this work is work that I'm doing with two doctoral students at the George Washington University, Hannah Kremer and Isabel Villamor Martin. And they're actually the ones who have been leading these studies. But what I want to do is present that work and then circle back to thinking about what are the top-down approaches we can take and what are the bottom-up approaches so that we can all feel that we are part of this movement to create a more inclusive environment for our junior colleagues. Okay, so this might not be hard for some of you at all, but imagine being a junior woman in a male-dominated industry and how that feels. And then if you think about that, how can you find your way in this environment? What is sort of the first thing you think about? The first thing you think about is that you're going to, as a junior woman in a male-dominated industry or organization, you're going to look to senior women as role models to how you can get by, how you can succeed in this environment. Okay, and it's a really typical expectation that these senior women are going to be supportive role models. But meanwhile, these senior leaders are experiencing a lot of difficulty themselves. So as I mentioned to you, I study leaders at the very top of organizations, so CEOs of publicly traded companies. And my colleague Elaine Wong and I, who's at UC Riverside, are just finishing up a study where we're looking at the bias that female CEOs in relation to male CEOs experience from various stakeholders. And we're specifically focusing on the media. And this is just a little side story I'm going to tell you, but it turns out that the media has gender bias, where they ask a lot of different questions of female CEOs than they do of male CEOs. And what that means is that then women have to spend more time responding to things that are less strategic than their male counterparts. So as an example, Laura Albers, the CEO of Williams-Sonoma, was asked, do you think there's a double standard in how women are covered in the media? And she responds, a lot of times in interviews, questions are asked that would never be asked of a man. I don't want young women to believe that it's so difficult to be a CEO because they're female, or that they have to be so concerned about having children because it must be so difficult. Everyone spends so much time talking about it. In other words, there is bias, and it's hard to get past that fact that you're a woman at the top. And it's, that's just one sort of form of bias that these women at the top might experience. We know that they face discrimination. We know they feel devalued and stereotyped. That there's plenty of research that shows that women tend to be perceived as not as a good fit for the established leader prototype. We think leader, we think male. And so the implication is that female leaders may conclude their identities as women will actually hold them back in terms of their career success. And this is this idea of social identity threat, that their identity is a threat. And so they have to think about how they manage that threat. So if discrimination leads to experiencing negative views of their gender identity, there are a number of different ways that women or that discriminated group can manage that threat. So there are collective strategies of, as a group, we can rise up against being low status. But there's also these individual strategies I can engage in to try and get myself out of the situation I am that is belonging to a low status group, like being a woman in a male-dominated industry. So what the researchers find is that senior women are often forced to take these individual mobility strategies where they seek to escape, avoid, or deny belonging to the low status group, such as being a woman, and instead try and attempt to pass as a member of the higher status group, in this case, the sort of male group. And so then they begin to act more like a man in order to be accepted and be seen as a leader. And the implications of such behavior are that what would seemingly, we would assume, have been a supportive situation for junior women and senior women becomes what seems to be competitive. And this is what's known as the queen bee phenomenon. And it involves three elements of when a woman, and again, I have to be very clear that this is not an attack on senior women. This is about an environment that discriminates against these women, that creates sort of a hostile situation whereby they have to manage the situation by engaging in these behaviors where they present themselves more like men, they physically and psychologically distance themselves from other women, and they endorse and legitimize the current gender hierarchy to like, it's okay. I've been able to get by, and this hasn't been a problem for me. Thereby, I don't think it's a problem for other women. And there's been some support for this queen bee phenomenon. So there was a study by Dirks and colleagues of senior female police officers that found that when they sort of highlighted this male-dominated element of their industry, they were more likely to eschew their female identity. They've been found to then specifically align themselves more with masculine identities by engaging in behaviors that demonstrate their commitment to the norms of sort of the male majority, and even sort of appearing more biased towards other women in an effort to try and exhibit the fact that they're not biased in terms of being more favored, showing favoritism to other women. So there has been some support for this idea of the queen bee effect. So if male-dominated organizations increase the need for junior women to find role models, to find support, in order to feel that they belong. There's that, but then on the other hand, we're also seeing that then there's limited exposure to them, and that these women may actually be pushing them away in an effort to manage their own careers and their own situation. So we've seen this in past research, and I think what my colleagues and I have felt is that a next important question is, what is the cost of female subordinates when they're working under these women? How do these junior women respond to queen bee behavior? So what we know so far is that senior women engaging in these individual mobility strategies where they're trying to sort of distance themselves from their gender and sort of attach themselves more to a masculine identity is not perceived as biased by other senior women or by men. And that's kind of a common effect we see, but for junior women, it's very different. They experience increased negative emotions, anger, sadness, anxiety, lowered confidence, a feeling that they lack positive role models, so they don't know clearly how to navigate their career going forward. It's more difficult. And so for us, then, we want to understand how this impacts junior colleagues' career aspirations and what specifically the psychological mechanisms are that affect how they feel. And the psychological mechanism we specifically focus on is belonging uncertainty. So if we think of all the motives that we have, belonging is one of the most fundamental motives that drive how we connect, how we survive in this world. We really wouldn't, from the very beginning of time, survived if we didn't belong in small groups. And so a very adaptive motive has resulted of being just this desire to belong. So belonging uncertainty is when I feel people like me just don't belong here, right? And that's kind of the lay person's version of it, but it's a doubt about whether you'll be accepted or rejected by key figures in a social environment that matters to you. And what we know is that one way to feel a sense of belonging is finding people who are similar to yourself. That when you connect with similar others, like another woman, a senior woman in your organization, you're more likely to feel like you belong. And so junior women may be looking for these senior women to feel a sense of belonging in an environment, a male-dominated industry organization where they feel already uncertain about their sense of belonging. But if these senior women are engaging in queen bee behaviors to manage the situation for themselves, then these junior women may not obtain the sense of belonging that they anticipated. And so the first very basic hypothesis for us is that female leaders engaging in queen bee behavior increases belonging uncertainty in female subordinates. It's not, that in itself is not very controversial. But then, so what's the impact? And so there's been quite a bit of research on what belonging uncertainty does to individuals. When I don't feel like I belong, then I'm really uncertain as to my career path. I'm really uncertain as to and it's actually, I guess, more specifically even focused on the academic domain. So for example, Walton and Cohen have done some incredibly important, interesting studies published in Science about undergraduate students and Black versus white students in computer science. This is where they started with this work. And what they had these students do was they had them list friends, close friends. So they were asked either, there were multiple conditions, either list a lot of friends, like 8 very close friends, or 2 close friends. And this is a manipulation that's commonly used within psychology, is when you are asked to come up with a long list, you invariably can't fill it. And so it makes you feel like you're lacking in some way. So when asked to list 8 close friends, that is supposed to kind of prime the sense that you're lacking friends and increase this sense of belonging uncertainty. And what they found is that for those Black students and computer science majors, when they were in that condition and they had to list all these friends and couldn't do it, they felt a heightened sense of belonging uncertainty. I don't know if I belong here at this institution compared to their white counterparts. Not only that, it threatened their sense of academic fit. Do I belong in this major? Would I recommend this major to my friends? And so what this suggests is that when someone particularly who's in a minority position, so in this case, Black students in this academic institution, when they feel a sense of threat, that it then not only does it affect their sense of belonging, but it affects their sense that they fit in their organization or fit in the academic institution in this case. So extrapolating that to women in male-dominated organizations, we argue that when these women feel that they don't belong because they're not connecting with these senior women, that they are more likely to distance themselves from these women engaging in queen behavior. They're also going to have less of a desire to be in a leadership role and be more likely to turn over. So the implications for their career can be quite severe. So this is my really ugly model, but the basic idea is that exposure to a queen bee leader or queen bee behavior in particular is going to increase a sense of belonging and certainty for junior women, and that's going to reduce their career aspirations. They're going to distance themselves from their leader. They're going to reduce their desire to engage in leadership roles, and they're going to increase their desire to turn over from their organization. So we conducted 3 studies to examine these hypotheses. The first was an exploratory qualitative study where we conducted semi-structured interviews of 20 women early in their career. So they were in their late 20s, had been working for about 5 years. And out of the 20 that we interviewed, 16 had experienced an unsupportive female leader at some point during their work experience. Now, we followed a protocol for these interviews in which we adapted the interview process as we went. So it was semi-structured. And I'm really, all of my results right now are really, I'm just kind of presenting at a very basic level, but the first thing that we found was a pretty common theme about belonging uncertainty for these women who had faced unsupportive leaders. So one said, I figured she would be easier to connect to, but I worried she was passive aggressive, and I was right about the latter, giving a sense that she didn't really feel like she belonged. And another example, a woman in finance, in my own experience with her, I have felt like she doesn't support me, even though I come to her specifically for career advice. She dismisses me and has a tone as if I'm asking a stupid question. I genuinely have no clue why she acts this way towards me. In terms of career aspirations, there was a lot of indication of distancing themselves. A junior woman in entertainment stated, I try to project myself as a person who's independent of my boss. I share personal information with others as I work at work so that they know that I'm not a total robot like she is. I think that it helps make other people like me, but my boss is known for being a powerhouse. In terms of leader aspirations, I guess I don't feel like I'm like her because all the female leaders I know are extremely political, and I don't think I am. So maybe I'm not cut out to be a leader here. And in terms of turnover, I'm not sure how I feel about working in the industry long term. There's not really anyone here that's shown me the ropes to do that successfly. And I'm just seeing a question here about...
Yes, I was just going to say that you have 2 questions. Layla, would you like to ask your question? I'm going to unmute you.
Sure.
Oh, you are already unmuted. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a quick question. So a lot of your examples are from industry, finance. We had one example from the police force. Do you find that, or are there any studies specifically in academia, or do you have, any, I don't know, experience, or have you done research about how these findings, hold up in academic research, for example?
Yeah, and that's a great question because, so as I mentioned before, this is work that I'm doing with 2 doctoral students, female doctoral students. So it has certainly caused a lot of kind of meta sort of analysis of my own views. And I mean, beyond anecdotal, there is some research that shows that junior academics do feel a similar set of that this queen bee effect is going on within academia with more senior female professors. And so I do think that this effect does generalize. I have not done any of that research myself, and I do think that's something we actually, with these two doctoral students, we're actually conducting some work on academic teams. And so I think that's something that's really important to explore, but the basic work that I know that's out there does indicate that this is something that generalizes as well. And I mean, I think if we think about academia, we can definitely think about it being as a male-dominated industry in a lot of ways. And if we then go into science, and I do have some work that's been done within the science field, and the way that women do feel marginalized. And so I think that these are effects that we need more research, but I think then the research that's been done indicates that this is something that does generalize.
Thank you. And then we have another question. What is the impact of queen bees on junior male subordinates? In other words, are these effects on career only valid for female subordinates or also for male ones?
And that's a great question, and that's something that we have not tackled in terms of looking in these interviews. We only talked to female junior associates. However, in one of our later studies that I'm going to present, we do look at the effects on male subordinates, and we don't find that they have the same experience. They don't really react to either supportive or unsupportive female leaders in a way that is different from how they'd act to just sort of like a control condition. So these are effects that we're finding are independent for female junior subordinates. That's a great question. Thank you. So what this initial study is showing is just that there was a common theme, certainly, about belonging uncertainty. Really, it's not surprising. I think that within male-dominated industries, that belonging uncertainty is an experience that women face. This experience is then exacerbated when working for an unsupportive female leader, because there's an assumption that you're going to be able to go to that person to get that sense of belonging, and then don't. And that also that questioning one's career was also a common theme. So for us, the next step was to examine more closely causal mechanisms. And so we did that through utilizing the next two studies, I'll just warn you, are from Mechanical Turk, and some people have very strong feelings about that. Within the business schools, it is actually seen as a pretty decent way to study managers, to study employees, because you're getting a range of people who have had a range of work experience. Now, we conducted a study using Cyberball, and I don't know if that's something that any of you are familiar with, but this is sort of the Cyberball design, so I'll just explain it very briefly. So you are brought into this context. In this case, we said that they were going to be working in a team called a Cyberball team, with a coach named Jessica and with a team member named Robert. And then we only recruited women for this study. So they were going to be playing a game of passing a ball back and forth, and it was going to be a virtual ball toss. And so what happens with Cyberball is that there typically are two conditions. One condition is where they start out throwing the ball between the three different players, and it continues where they just kind of are randomly passing it back and forth, but everyone gets the ball a similar amount of time. The other condition happens where they start out the same way, they're all just kind of passing the ball to one another, but then the participant all of a sudden gets left out of the ball tossing, and the other two kind of are more often passing it back and forth to one another. So it highlights that sense of belonging uncertainty or ostracism that an individual can feel. This is a pretty strong manipulation. So again, what we had happen was these two different conditions where it was a female coming in onto this team and she was playing with her coach, who was a woman, versus a male counterpart, a peer, male peer. And either she was in a situation where everybody was getting the ball passed equally, or she was kind of getting left out of the ball toss and Robert was getting more of the ball tosses. So we then had them, after they completed this exercise, we then had them answer a bunch of questions about whether they felt like they belonged in the situation, whether they wanted to differentiate themselves from their coach, Jessica, whether they wanted to assume a leadership role in this context, whether they wanted to leave their cyberball team.
Dr. Ormiston, you have another question. Ashley, I will unmute you. Go ahead.
Suck my dick, bitch. Fuck you, bitch. Stupid bitch. Ugly bitch. Nasty bitch.
So, yeah, I think we can.
Suck my dick, bitch. Fuck you, bitch.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay. So what we found in this situation was that those exposed to the queen bee behavior were more uncertain about their belonging and led them to a desire to differentiate themselves from their coach and want to turn over or leave that cyberball team. We didn't find that this queen bee behavior had any effect on their desire to engage in leadership behaviors, but I think cyberball is a great context to make people feel like they belong or don't belong, but it was, given it's a simulated context, it really wasn't a great environment necessarily to measure leadership behaviors. And so we wanted to conduct another study in which we more closely examined this in a business context. But I think that this generally, again, just highlighted this sense of lack of belonging and what the implications, I mean, we very heavily manipulated a lack of belonging, but what the implications of belonging uncertainty might be for career aspirations in terms of wanting to distance yourself from your leader and wanting to get out of this situation, which really, frankly, is probably an adaptive reaction. So in the final study that I want to present, we conducted another MTurk study. And in this case, it was a vignette in which we asked them to imagine they were worked as a consultant, and they were either in the queen bee condition, they were in a supportive leader condition, or they were in a control condition. And just to kind of give you a sense of what they were asked, imagine you were working on a team at Global Solutions consulting firm, your background is in management consulting, and you're tasked with developing a project for an international company. Jessica, a female director who has been at the company for 10 years, manages your team. Over the past 10 years, Jessica has steadily climbed the ranks of this male-dominated organization. She's known for her hard work, diligence, and her dominant communication style. Her colleagues remark on her assertiveness as well as her willingness to defend her own beliefs. Unlike the majority of women at Global Solutions, Jessica is not a member of the Global Solutions Women in Business group. When you overheard a coworker asking Jessica about why she's not involved in the group, she responded saying that she feels it's not problematic, but the current hierarchy of Global Solutions is still male-dominated. So this is obviously the queen bee behavior, and it does come across as pretty strong manipulation. But we are trying to follow along with the three elements of the queen bee phenomenon definition. The more supportive leader was, obviously she was involved in this women in business group and she was more supportive of women. The control condition ended after that first paragraph that's not bolded. So what we found was that those exposed to...
Sorry, we have another question.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll ask it here. How does cybercall represent what goes on in the workplace when it excludes the participant but has the other person engaged? In the workplace, the queen bee isn't ignoring the female subordinate but focusing on the male subordinates. She's ignoring everyone equally, right?
So that's a great question, and I actually think that would be something that probably, in retrospect, would require some further empirical inquiry. So our take on the queen bee phenomenon is that that the senior leaders are female senior leaders are specifically distancing themselves from supporting their female counterparts or subordinates. And there is some research from Duguid and colleagues which suggests that actually that they're not doing this as much to their male subordinates or male counterparts, but it's more focused specifically on female. So that was why we took that. But you're right. I mean, I think that there are some limitations to the cyberball. Really, our goal was to have sort of take a heavy hand in manipulating the belonging uncertainty and what that effect might be. But I think that would be a future design element that would be important.
Thank you.
And Mary, just
Okay, Mary, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Oh, hi.
hi.
So my question has to do with my experience as having been aggressed upon by people like earlier in the stage of their career, lack of respect. But it seems that a lot of people are threatened as we go up or experiencing difficulties in making your voice heard. So it seems to me that we have to start training people across positions to make communication kind of like people more aware of how communication can impact people. Leadership, you know, top down, but the top down analysis doesn't seem to be wholly generalizable. We're hearing, you know, men feel it or women focusing on helping men. You know, there just needs to be better communication and training across disciplines, across positions, and across genders.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. I think it's a really important point about across gender. I think, so I certainly, again, when I said this was controversial, this research is controversial in that I really don't like the feeling that we are throwing stones at senior women who already have a lot of stones thrown at them. It's really to understand the impact when the situation does arise. But for us, an important future research direction is to understand what happens, to what extent also are junior women, or not just junior women, but people generally negatively stereotyping this queen bee effect, that they perceive that this exists when in fact maybe it doesn't. You know, I think the fact that, I mean, there are many things I could think about with this interview, the interviews that we took, we really made a huge effort to not bias our subjects to automatically recall negative events with senior women. But the fact that 16 out of 20 could recall one, it does beg the question of, are we all biased against senior women to some extent? Is it men? Is it women? Is it junior? Is it senior? I think that we all, I mean, I think we're in this time right now of getting comfortable being uncomfortable, and that involves questioning our biases that we have to other groups, to our own group. And I think that, Mary, to your point, I think there's a lot of training that could help, and in terms of awareness of bias that we might have ourselves, again, even to our own groups that we belong to, as well as how to better communicate. So thank you for that. So again, I think that there was a general takeaway that we found is that the female participants in our study did feel that they felt a higher sense of belonging and uncertainty compared to those in the supportive leader condition or just the control condition, and that led them to want to differentiate and they had greater intentions to build solutions. And then I think what was important to a question that we had earlier is that the male participants in our study were unaffected by either the queen bee or supportive leader condition compared to the control condition. It didn't affect their belonging, their sense of belonging. It didn't affect the degree to which they wanted to associate with this leader. And I think that in itself is an interesting thing about whether you have, I mean, these of course weren't these were specifically about supportive leaders or unsupportive leaders to other women. But what it is suggesting is that for men, it just isn't irrelevant. For these male participants in our study, it was an irrelevant factor for them. So I think that we need to do a lot more research on studying how men versus women respond to female leaders, how male versus women, men versus women respond to male leaders who are supportive or unsupportive. I think it kind of just begs a lot of questions for us. So we do find general support for this model, and for us, I think that to us it suggests the ripple effect of gender bias that is occurring within male-dominated industries. That when junior women don't feel like they belong, it really is pushing them to consider their career aspirations, and that this cost isn't occurring for male subordinates but for female subordinates. And so to us, I mean, it suggests a lot of future directions, some of which I've already mentioned. But I think importantly, it suggests that we really need to think about what we can do to foster a sense of belonging for our junior female colleagues.
So we have another question. Is it possible that because the industry is male-dominated, the female subordinates were expecting too much in terms of closeness from the queen bees, for example, that they would be gal pals, an expectation that they may not have had in a female-dominated industry? Yeah,
I think that is really an important thing, is that I think there are very high expectations on, and in the research that I have been doing on female versus male CEOs, that's something that female CEOs talk about, is the expectations on them to be supportive, and that these same expectations aren't there for men, male CEOs, to provide that support. And so I think that and this is moving a little bit beyond what you're saying, but then the standard and expectation is so high for these women that it's actually easier for them to fail. So actually our view of what is queen bee behavior may actually not be something that is that evil or wrong, but it doesn't match what our expectation of being these gal pals is. And so the standards and expectations are kind of too high for these women. So I think that's a really important area for future research. And I think that would be interesting then to compare it with more female-dominated industries and the expectations that we have. It's a great question. So when I started this talk, I talked about the top-down versus the bottom-up approach. And I think it's important for us to think about both sides, because depending on where we are in the system, there's something for all of us to do. So in terms of actually just the research that's been done explicitly on how to reduce the impact of belonging uncertainty, Walton and Cohen conducted another study in 2011 where they created an intervention for first-year undergraduates. What they had been finding in their earlier work is that minority individuals, and they were studying in that earlier 2007 study, they talked about Black students versus white students, that the Black students felt less like they belonged in this academic institution than the white students. So they created this intervention for first-year undergraduates, highlighting that social adversity is shared but short-lived. And so their intervention really was focused on the fact that this is something that we all experience regardless of our race, regardless if we're a minority in this environment or not. When we start college first year, there's going to be some hard times for all of us. So they cited in the intervention, they cited some studies that were done. They had some quotes from students like freshman year. Even though I met large numbers of people, I didn't have a small group of close friends. I was pretty homesick, and I had to remind myself that making close friends takes time. Since then, I've met people, some of whom are now just as close as my friends in high school were. Okay, so they did this intervention, and then they studied the GPAs of the students during their time at college. And what they found is that just this tiny intervention about helping people frame how they see their social connection at the university had a significant effect on those Black students in terms of their academic performance. So I think this is an area that really does require additional research, specifically in the domain of gender. But I think it's something that we can extrapolate, is that making it clear to people, to women in male-dominated academic institutions, in industries, in science, that it is normal to feel at first that you don't necessarily belong, that there might be some sort of social adversity that you feel, but that over time you're going to connect with people and get past that to kind of normalize that feeling. Another key thing is to make people feel, so what we know, and where I started this talk, was that one way we feel a sense of belonging is if we feel similar to others. So we know in business research that we hire people like ourselves, we coach people like ourselves, we promote people like ourselves, and on and on and on. And so I think the top-down approach, the people in power really have to take an honest approach and take some personal responsibility for this reality. We all prefer people like ourselves, and it impacts the decisions that we make. And if we
Dr. Ormiston, we have a question. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, thank you.
The question is, do you have any suggestions for male co-workers specifically at all levels? Like when they're subordinates, colleagues, or bosses, how can we help our female co-workers when they are in these types of situations?
That's a great question. And actually, one of my wonderful colleagues at George Washington University, Katina Sawyer, is doing work on this on male champions. I'm not a huge, I don't love that name, but it's really important. It's very important work. And what it's highlighting is that men who step up and support women, specifically women in their career, they're deeming them male champions, can have a hugely positive impact on these women in advancing their careers. And one way that is, that they highlight is by stepping up to gender bias. So when someone, for example, says something that might be biased or inappropriate, that they step up and say that that's not appropriate, or when they specifically advocate for their junior female colleagues. And I think it's kind of to this point here is taking personal responsibility and being honest that we do, men, women, everyone, white, black, we have this tendency and to prefer people like ourselves. So we have to put ourselves in check and take responsibility for that. And then we also, as leaders, need to work to find similarities with those who may seem different to us, because the reality is that we're all different from each other and we're all similar to each other in some ways. So if we work to find those similarities, then we'll have an easier time of making those connections.
And we have another question. This one is specific to academic research settings, I guess, but do you think that some issues may stem from a lack of training for senior leaders on personnel management and being a boss? I've noticed that at least in academics research, career development doesn't necessarily include skill development for interacting with subordinates or how to handle conflicts, assign work, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, and I do think that there's a need for it, and I do see some academic institutions. I know actually at Stanford there is a big initiative right now to encourage learning how to communicate, whether it's with your patients or with your colleagues, but that I think that we don't spend enough time developing within academia, and I actually have been working with some research teams recently at George Washington to help them learn some of these things, because I don't think we do it enough. I see other questions.
Yes, we have one here. You had talked about how the queen bee phenomenon has a strong impact on junior colleagues' career. I would like to know how women who engage in queen bee behavior have possibly affected their own careers.
The assumption is that there are some sort of benefits to that in the short term, in terms of buffering yourself and making, in terms of associating with the higher power, higher status group. I think that there is a need for more research in that area, though, But I think there is this general assumption that there may be individual benefits to engaging in those individual mobility strategies, but then there are these downstream consequences that aren't as positive. So again, I think that this highlighting similarities is really something that's pretty important. Another is confidence building. And I think there are a number of ways that we can work to build the confidence of junior colleagues. And that's something by making someone feel more confident, they may feel that they belong in the environment that they're in. And again, I think that this is something that really does apply to the experience of women in science, the science fields. Just to start with my bullets, the first is this very basic thing from the business world, which is in giving feedback. A lot of times when people give feedback, they think about giving critical feedback. And certainly within academia, that is the propensity, is to give critical feedback. The review process, every element of our career revolves around critical feedback and being able to handle that. But actually within the business world, the research and kind of rule of thumb is that when we give feedback to our subordinates, to those around us, we should be looking for positive things to help reinforce the behavior that we want to see. So it should be 80% positive feedback, 20% critical feedback. And I think that to the earlier question that we had about in academia, we don't really learn these things. I think that's very true. I think we are learned, we learn to be critical, and that's, certainly within academia and in my past institutions, it's a badge of honor to be incredibly critical of others. But we actually need to focus on the behaviors we want to see by being positive and seeking them out and pointing them out and being very specific.
So we have two questions. The first one is the queen bee phenomenon also seen in a female-dominant industry?
That, Victoria, is a great question that I think is something that warrants research. I don't have an answer to that. I think that's an empirical question that's important for us to understand.
And we have another question. Sorry, Victoria, I didn't unmute you, but AY, if you want to ask the question yourself.
Hi, it's Anastasia. I forget that not everyone knows what AY means. So thank you so much for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I was wondering if you could comment on research that has rejected the idea of this as an exclusively female syndrome and has shown similar dynamics between senior and junior men, or between senior and junior individuals in other underrepresented groups. Yet in those other groups, this is not termed a syndrome or called after an incident.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of research generally on supportive versus unsupportive leaders, and because leaders have tended to be male, I think that the assumption can be that that absolutely the consequences for unsupportive leadership might be similar when we look at men. I think your point is really well taken. We don't call this a syndrome or phenomenon. We don't label it with a derogatory term like queen bee. I think that's really, I don't like that term, the queen bee phenomenon, or the fact it is meant to be derogatory. It is sort of highlighting this fact, and so it's trying to be controversial in a way that isn't meaning to be derogatory to women. But I think that the way we kind of throw it around it can easily be, and I think it's a point well taken that we really need to think about the fact that we should not be attacking senior women, and I think there are who sort of coined, or sort of the earlier work that was done on this have really tried to assert the fact that this is a situational effect that occurs for these women, and this is not about these women being bad. But it's a point well taken, and I think it's an important area as we advance in this area of work that we really highlight that fact. In terms of building confidence, a study that was done just 10 years ago on females within the STEM undergraduate degrees. And what they did was they were trying to encourage the use of self-affirmations. And self-affirmations are really focusing on what you value most, what's important to you and guides you in your life. And it's a really simple intervention. This was for first-year students who were taking a physics class, female students, and they had them list their most important values, like in terms of relationships with others or gaining new knowledge, and have them write about why these values were important to them. And they had them do it twice during the semester for 15 minutes. So it's 30 minutes over the course of the semester. And they either had female STEM students do this manipulation where they had to write about values that were important to them, or the other control condition where they actually wrote about values that weren't important to them. And what they found is that for those that wrote about these values that were important to them, they ended up performing much better in the physics class, and that it had this positive impact on their performance and their sense of that they were kind of, I mean, again, there's the confidence that they belonged in this major. And there has been plenty of research in different minority groups and different domains studying the power of self-affirmations. And so I think that's something that we can think of as a bottom-up strategy. We should be thinking about what our core values are and what guides us and brings us strength, whether it's our family and friends, but that actually just kind of centering yourself and encouraging your junior colleagues to center themselves can be powerful. We know from Carol Dweck's work from Stanford on the growth mindset and the incredible power of the growth mindset of, as a leader, highlighting to your subordinates how much you believe that we can and we do develop, that we're not fixed in our ability, are fixed in our intelligence, but that in fact we can grow. And that, you know, there's been research on teachers, on leaders, on cancer patients, that when we have this growth mindset, it has an incredibly powerful impact. And it can build confidence because you believe that you can change. That we can prime power, that if we have a sense of power, that we're going to be much more feeling confident. And so priming power involves just thinking of a time you had control over resources, or even, which has been somewhat controversial, the power poses of taking on the sort of superwoman pose of like feeling, expanding your posture, feeling that you have control of your environment.
So Dr. Ormiston, I just wanted to say it's almost 1 o'clock. I just want to be respectful of your time. If you do have the time, we have another question, or if you want to welcome more questions, up to you.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I want to be respectful of everyone else's time. I do just want to make sure that, you know, that we also highlight the bottom-up approach, and just making sure that you, as a junior individual, recognize that, you know, I mean, yes, the system, the structure, the top, you know, is very powerful, but we still have some power over what we do ourselves. And I think networks like the one that you guys have developed is an incredibly powerful one, but there are these other things that we can do. Finding similarities with those in power, finding our champions, even if, whether they're male or female, thinking about the fit we have with our organization. We have to advocate for ourselves and engage in these bottom-up approaches as well as the top-down. But that pretty much sums up what I wanted to say. So I would love to hear a couple more questions.
Yes, so we have 2 more questions here. The first one being, the queen bee phenomenon is often villainized in media, where women in power are often seen as the bad guy. How might this affect young women who see these stereotypes and may want to avoid them? Do you think it has an impact on how powerful women are perceived in society?
I think it absolutely does. I think we know that for female leaders, they have to be seen as competent and warm, whereas male leaders only have to be seen as competent. I think we can think of, very political examples of female leaders who, you know, may be only seen as one, and then are given very derogatory bad names for not being seen also as warm, and that also then, I think there's lots to say about that then in terms of how we think about feminism and people's sort of pullback on not wanting to come across as a feminist, and now there was that whole period of time. So I think that we have to be very careful with the terms that are used, and we have to try and understand these stereotypes. And really that's the research that we're aiming to do, is to understand the impact of this effect, but going forward is to understand the degree to which how much this is stereotyped by both men and women, this effect, to the degree to which it's actually real.
And then we have one more question. Does the queen bee phenomenon develop suddenly, or are there any characteristics females with this syndrome show during the development of their career?
Well, I know, so one thing is the degree to which a woman identifies with her gender identity. So past research has shown, by Dirks and colleagues, has shown that women who are less identified, and I mean that is in part the definition of a queen bee, is pushing back from that identity, but the more that I disengage from that identity, the more likely I am to engage in behaviors that I distance myself from junior colleagues. So that would be one factor. And I think that's an unfortunate effect of being in what may seem like a hostile environment, that is a survival strategy in order to manage your own career, is to kind of step back from your gender identity. So I think one part I didn't touch upon, which is from the top-down approach, is encouraging authenticity in the work environment, is allowing people to be themselves. That leaders need to really make sure they understand the total person of their subordinates, of their team, and that by allowing people to bring their authentic selves to work, that actually is a way to hopefully avoid some of those issues, and to encourage people to feel good about who they are and their multiple identities.
Well, thank you so much. I think those were all of the questions that we had. Thank you again for talking to us today. It's such an interesting topic that even if the research is mostly done in industry, definitely applies to academia at all levels, because even for younger or more junior people or graduate students, we still have people who we mentor and we try to lead. So thank you. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you so much, Roy. And please send me an email if you have other questions. I'm happy to discuss further and hear your points of view on this. It's such an important topic. So thank you so much for including me today.
Wonderful.